Okay. Thanks, Ivan, first of all, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming today and for having me. I will start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country from which I'm presenting. I'm in Meanjin, Brisbane, on the banks of Maywar, the Brisbane River. This is Yagara and Turrbal country. I acknowledge that the traditional owners, the elders, past and present, and just like to say that these lands have always been have always been places of learning, teaching, and research. I will also acknowledge the Kumbamara and Yugambeh people of the Griffith Gold Coast area, and welcome to anybody from Chennai. Okay, so just a bit of an overview. I will talk a little bit about the current context in higher education of and the challenges that generative and opportunities that generative AI has presented us with. Then I'll talk a little bit about the implications of generative AI for assessment. And then I'll talk about the relevance of problem-based learning. And I say problem-based learning. Problem-based learning and project-based learning are often used in the same way as PBL. There are differences, so I'll talk mostly about problem-based learning, but a lot of what I'll talk about is also relevant to project-based learning. And much of that relates to assessing process rather than content, and I'll talk about that in detail and the relevance of it. So authentic assessment is very much part of both approaches, and then we might have a bit of a discussion at the end. So before we get started, I'll just show you a little video to get you thinking about this. So yeah, the reason why I showed you that is just because it's a kind of fundamental principle of learning by doing, which underlies the idea of problem-based learning. So in terms of the current context, when it comes to generative AI, these are the relevant standards from Texas standards. And Texas, the body that all universities have to comply with in Australia. So the relevant standards from the higher education standards framework are methods of assessment have to be consistent with learning outcomes being assessed and the level of study. And students are only awarded a degree when they have demonstrated achievement of the learning outcomes. So this is how Australian universities get accredited. So this raises a few questions that you can ask yourself in the context of generative AI. So do your current methods of assessment still provide the necessary assurance of demonstrating learning outcomes? You can ask yourself if your learning outcomes are still the right ones. Things have changed a little. Things can be done with ChatGPT. That may change the way you think about learning outcomes. Sorry, yeah, no, there was a bit of background noise there. And the other question is, how can employers, the public and professional bodies be confident that graduates have acquired the necessary capabilities and knowledge? And of course, we're talking about here something that is dynamic, right? Because at the moment, technological changes mean that, you know, what is relevant today, in 3 years' time at the end of a degree, things may have shifted. So we're basically dealing with an enormously dynamic environment at the moment, and with some significant shifts. So that's kind of part of the context. Jason Lodge, who is at University of Queensland here across the river, and his colleagues have created a taxonomy of options and viability around generative AI in relation to assessment. And I've come up with 6 things to consider. You can either ignore AI tools, you can ban them, you can invigilate, you can embrace them, you can try and design around them, or you can rethink assessment altogether. So they've done some thinking around this, and this is kind of what they've come up with as a response. So there's a short-term, medium-term, long-term. If you ignore it, you might get away with, like, for example, ChatGPT. If you ignore it, that it exists, you might get away with that for a little while. But in the medium term and the long term, that doesn't work. Because, yeah, you can ban it, which is in the short term very problematic because detection is a problem. In the medium term, it becomes risky, and that's partly because these tools are part of working environments, become part of working environments, and therefore will become part of expected skill sets of graduates. So banning them, yeah, is probably not a good option. In the long term, it's definitely a really bad option. Invigilating relates to using exams for assessment, invigilated exams. You can do that in the short term where appropriate, in the medium term where appropriate, and in the long term. So it's always appropriate to some extent, but it can't be the only option because there are limitations of what exams can assess, right? So you can embrace it. And if you embrace AI tools, you have to be mindful of equity issues because the tools themselves change all the time. There are costs involved. There are issues around language. There are issues around students with different abilities. So all of that needs to be taken into account. In the medium term, embrace it where it's appropriate. And in the long term, this is probably a very viable option. As long as you recognize that it's a dynamic environment and you constantly adjust your assessment in response. So design around means designing assessment that tries to avoid using AI tools. In the short term, that's risky because it requires you to then try and work out if people have been using it, and that relates to detection, which becomes a problem. In the medium and long term, it therefore becomes almost pointless. Or you can rethink assessment altogether and what it looks like in the context of AI and what kind of elements you need to consider. So in the short term, that requires a lot of time and effort. But in the meantime, and in medium term and the long term, that's kind of like where we probably should be thinking of going. But, you know, it's very early days. So we have to, there's a lot of thinking to be done, and potentially organizational changes have to be involved in that as well. Okay, so just a few words about detection. By the way, the links that are in this presentation, I will send the presentation to Ivan to be shared with all of you who are here today. And so you will have access to these links. This particular article, which is currently in preprint but will be published reasonably soon, has tested 14 different AI detection tools and discovered that basically none of them works well enough to warrant their use in education. So, and that's kind of a common theme. So detection is basically almost pointless. This came out last week sometime, and it shows the problem. It shows kind of what the potential problem is with detection as well, because detection, if you can't prove it, means that there's a lot of suspicion around this might be done by AI tools. It might not be. How can you prove it? This particular image was not. It was an image that was shot on a phone, but it kind of looks like it could be done by AI. So, you know, it creates, in short, it creates all sorts of potential problems, and it creates a whole lot of effort. Okay, so the main consideration for assessment design then is why it's like to go back to the fundamentals, right? So why are we assessing our students? What is it that we're trying to assess? And how are we gathering evidence that learning has been achieved? Now, the Monash learning and teaching site has a particular page about generative AI and assessment, Monash University, which is very good and very comprehensive. So the next few slides are based on what is on that site. I would recommend you go and have a look at that at some stage, because it's very, it has some very good advice. So they talk about key options for assessment design in this new context. So the first thing you can do is check your assessment task against generative AI tools. You can paste an entire assessment brief into ChatGPT, for example, and see what it produces. In some cases, and we did this, I did a workshop with electrical engineers yesterday, and people did this. And in many cases, the answers were pretty good. So if that's the case for your assessment task, then you might have to rethink that. And so you may have to add additional instructions into ChatGPT to try and fine-tune the results. An alternative option is to modify your current assessment task and prompts and processes. So you can modify questions to be more applied to each student's context, right? So that is about personalizing your assessment. So to add elements that students have to discuss that relate to a very specific element in their immediate context or in their professional environment. Or they have to discuss it in relation to their own local situation. And ChatGPT will struggle with that. Use more iterative processes of assessment, such as student peer review, which then leads to revisions of the work. So basically that is about building in different steps into your assessment, and they can be formative, but they would require students to explain themselves along the way. And I'll talk about that in a little bit later in relation to PBL as well, because it's very relevant. You could incorporate AI into assessment tasks. So you can you can build it into the task and allow students to use tools. But in that case, you can ask them to provide prompts that they used and show via track changes or commentary what changes they made to improve the output and why. And so this is basically about teaching students how to use the tools in productive ways. And it also teaches them to acknowledge that they've used the tools. Similarly, you can generate AI content and provide it to students for them to then evaluate what it's come up with and to revise it. You can also consider alternative assessment formats, and this is about using different modes, right? So most AI tools struggle with different modes. So they might be able to produce videos, or they might be able to produce images and text, but not all together in a fluid presentation. So you can ask students to do that, and then talk about the links between these different modes of artifacts, essentially, that they produce. You can then ask them to incorporate personal reflections on what they've done and why they've done it and how they've done it. And you can ask them to take part in live interviews. Now, we talked about this in yesterday's workshop quite a lot. And there are some concerns around, the time that this takes. But when I said earlier, organizations may have to rethink how they work around workloads to deal with this new context. So that's something that we all have to consider. The other part to that, to face-to-face interviews with students, is that there are equity issues around that. Not all students are, it's not beneficial for all students. Okay. So assess collaborative processes is another thing you can do rather than products. So think about the way that students get to a product, which means that they have to, it's a similar thing as what I discussed earlier. So it's, they have to discuss the steps they go to. So it's a kind of iterative process. So, for example, in an engineering project, each stage of the project can be annotated and reflected upon. And that could be what you're then assessing rather than the ultimate output, the ultimate product. So, for example, if you're currently assessing a report at the end of a project that a group of students is working on, you can ask at different stages of the project for explanations of what they're up to and what they've been doing and why. So part of doing that is targeting higher order thinking skills. So critical thinking, evaluation of practice, creativity. And all of that then points to personalized applications, showing individual or group working processes, and multimodal artifacts and interviews. So I've discussed most of that. And finally, you could consider using more formative assessment. And that's kind of similar to what I've talked about as well, but it's formative assessment for learning, rather than an emphasis on high stakes summative assessment of learning. Now, I realize that you can't, get rid of summative assessment of learning, because that's about standards of what has been learned, but you can incorporate more formative assessment as part of the process. And finally, programmatic assessment is about assessment that that is interlinked between different courses in an overall program or different units in an overall course. So that's so that different types of assessment that build on each other and that do similar things, but and there's a kind of consistency across a program. And so this is very relevant to if you use, for example, an approach like problem-based learning, because the assessment is very similar, and students get used to the types of assessment that they have to respond to. Okay, so at this point, I will, given these principles and given this context, I'll talk a little bit about problem-based learning and authentic assessment. So problem-based learning has been around for quite a long time, since the 60s, basically, and it grew, and it was initially established as part of medical education. Howard Barrows is one of the key founding fathers, so to speak, of problem-based learning, and he defines it like this. So the intent is to challenge the learner with problems found in practice, both as a stimulus for learning and a focus for organizing what has been learned and application to future work. So the learning activities are as authentic as possible, and the problems are as authentic as possible. And what I mean by that is that they're closely related to actual real-world activities that students might have to do in a real-world context. And ideally, the assessment tasks are framed in the same way as well. So the problem is situated in an actual context, ideally. So an actual work context. So key elements of PBL are that learning is triggered and stimulated by an authentic problem. Another key element is that students learn in groups, so they have to work together. Students are constantly engaging in iterative, adaptive, generative, and reflective processes. And this is kind of what I was mentioning earlier. So you're kind of talking about process. They have to constantly justify themselves and present and give updates on what they're doing, where their project is at, who's doing what and why. And that is quite, that happens in a specific context. So and so different students have to do different parts of it. And that's important, particularly in the context of AI. So the tutor and the lecturer are basically guides on the side. They facilitate the learning, they prompt students, but they don't lecture as such, unless students ask them for specific information or for specific parts of it that need to be explained. So a good problem, a well-designed problem in problem-based learning is a relevant problem, it's an authentic problem, and it's ideally ill-structured, which means it needs some analysis to work out what the problem is actually about. And this is not unusual because in an authentic context, because often when we have clients and they have a brief, they're not necessarily entirely specific about what they think the solution might be or what they actually even want. So you need to negotiate and you need to consider, basically do a problem analysis. And this is a very good skill to develop. So the role of problems in problem-based learning is that they allow students to recognize the limits of their prior knowledge because they have to when they first get together as a group, they have to consider what kind of expertise and knowledge they bring to the problem that they'll be working on, and they have to basically reflect on that, and then also consider what kind of knowledge they might need to address the problem. So, and they do that as a group. So there's a strong element of self-reflection in this, and so the problems need to be designed in such a way that they trigger what students need to know. So what do they need to learn to solve the problem or to address it? And are these skills made explicit in the learning outcomes of your particular unit or course? By the way, as a small interlude, the images in some of these slides have nothing to do with the content. They're just photos of Australian bird life, and I'd just like to make photos of them. So don't try and read any meaning into those. So, so good problems are motivating and interesting. They're similar to problems faced in real work. And relevant to the course of study, of course. Ideally, they're also presented in the same format as they might be presented in the real world. So that might be in the form of a memo, in the form of a project brief from a client, etc. Ideally, they're open-ended, so there's no single correct answer and no clear solution. So it requires negotiation amongst the group, and it requires inquiry and research as part of working out how to address it. Ideally, they're also multidisciplinary, but they may need different disciplinary specialist knowledge, and particularly in later years, and in an engineering context, that might mean that you have different engineering disciplines brought together into project teams, for example. Again, this requires some organization, and it's potentially a lot of work for people who coordinate this, but it's worth considering because the ultimate outcomes are potentially very beneficial, especially in the context of generative AI. They should contain an appropriate amount of complexity and challenge for students. So they should be aligned to where in a program a course is located. Yeah. Okay, so good problems are not structured sets of instructions. But having said that, if you do problem-based learning in the first year, you do obviously need some structure around this because students need some scaffolds to get used to the way of working around this. They're not questions at the end of a chapter either. Okay, so what does the teacher do if not straightforward teaching? So, like I said, the teacher plays a key role in the learning process by acting as a facilitator of activities that students undertake themselves. So they may assist in identifying and accessing resources needed to address the problem. They might give feedback and support during the problem-solving process, and they might evaluate students' participation in products. What that means, and when I said earlier, like it's an iterative process, and with different points of reporting back, you might get students to report back on a weekly basis. for example, in the form of presentations, updates, short presentations of what they've been working on and what some of the challenges they've encountered during that week. And then in that context, you give them feedback. So it's kind of formative in that sense. And of course, you know, you are responsible for designing the problem that students work on. So it needs to be, so you need to make sure that that's an appropriate problem to work on for the level that they're in. So this is a bit of an overview of the process itself, with different steps within it. And so this is the problem-based learning process. There are various this is an example of how it could work, right? So there's different variations to this. This is not a strict rule, but this is like gives you a broad idea of what a PBL process is and how it can work and what students do within that and what you do within it as a teacher. So as you can see, there's a lot of process-based learning around this. There's a lot of activities that students work on that are developmental, that are working towards an end product, but the end product is not the key here. The key is the process that they go through and what they learn along the way. So think about that carefully. So again, these are potential roles. And I said earlier, like we often do group work and we give students a task and we say to them, this is the task, this is the product that you have to produce at the end of it. Off you go as a group and I'll see you at the end of it. We then assume that they will know how to work together, how to distribute the work, and often that's not the case. So we have a lot of problems around students not doing what they're supposed to do, or some students not doing anything at all. And then we get lots of emails about about students not pulling their weight. But so a key thing to keep in mind here is that we need to actually teach what group work is and what it looks like and what the responsibilities are. Otherwise, it won't work. Now, initially, when you first start this process, these are some potential roles that you can use. Other roles could include, and when you get further into a program, these roles might be more authentic, shall we say. So there might be discipline-based roles related to discipline-based knowledge. So you have a group of students who come with different skills to address a particular problem. And that's kind of the ideal situation because that makes it more authentic in the long run. So these are kind of the key principles. So assessment drives learning, authentic assessment, and the differentiation between content and process. Now, if you think back to what I started off with in the context of generative AI, assessing process becomes increasingly important, and that's kind of the key theme of this whole presentation, I guess. So think about how you currently assess content and how you currently assess process, or if you currently assess process, and what that then looks like if you think about generative AI tools in the mix. So within PBL, these are some principles around assessments. Measure what you intend to measure and always refer it back to learning outcomes. Develop clear rubrics so that everyone is clear on what you're assessing, and that includes rubrics for process. So if you think it's important that students communicate in a particular way or in a professional manner, then make sure that that's part of the rubric and that that's being assessed. Use clear criteria and targets of performance. Make the what to be assessed tangible, observable, and unambiguous. I've talked about formative and summative assessment and continuous assessment, assessment for learning, and use different levels of learning as well. And I talked about that earlier, creativity, critical thinking, evaluation. They are part of the higher order thinking skills in Bloom's taxonomy, but you can start from year one and increase those skills as you go along. These are some examples of authentic assessment, but keep in mind that authentic assessment exists on a continuum. So it can be more or less authentic, and ideally by the end of a degree, students are able to work on projects that are high risk, that have clients involved, that are, so that they can perform at a level that they need to when they go into workplaces or when they start their own businesses. So these are some examples of potential authentic assessments that you can think about. But again, think about the idea of where the emphasis lies. Like, is it the product that you're assessing, or is it the process? If it's the product, can the product be produced by generative AI? If so, how are you going to deal with that? I'm looking at the clock, and this is where I'll leave it.
Thanks, Henk, for your interesting presentation. Let's see if there are questions. I saw like a few questions in the chat. Can you hear me right? Can you hear me right? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. So we have a comment from Simon. Just in case, much like being able to detect or use a file in student work. Okay. That's a go. So there is a question from Cesar. Project-based learning is excellent when students engage, right? What about other students who don't engage? I think this is a good question. Sometimes we see that, like we have like really good students who do like everything, and then we have like always like few students who not really interested in like how would you like engage them? They don't really want to be engaged.
It's a very good question, Cesar. The key answer is to make it accessible what they do within a group, and to differentiate according to roles. So what I said towards the end there, we don't often do that. We say here's a group, here's a project, go work on it. And yes, if you do that, there's always going to be there's going to be one or two students who are basically going to do the project, right? But if you make it part of the assessment that each student has to justify what they're doing and how they're doing it and why they're doing it, you can build that into the process, and you can build it into to the criteria as well, so that you essentially make them responsible for their contribution. And this is not, I mean, you can't get more authentic than that, because that is what happens in a workplace. People have to justify their performance. If there's no expectation around that, yeah, then you have a problem. I hope that makes sense.
Well, I think it does. Yeah, thanks. Are there any more questions anybody would like to ask using the mic or put it in the chat? I just want to ask you, Henk, so like what you think about this project-based learning, right? That's like really great thing. And I think this is something that we'd like to use more often. But one of this kind of not problems, disadvantages of, let's say, compared to other assessment items, it like takes lots of time, like when you need to assess it, because even like you mentioned that one of the things that students can do, they can do like oral presentations on like a weekly basis and stuff like that. So that will take lots of time, like to assess, right? Especially if you deal with like larger classes. So what are your thoughts about this? Because that will add additional load to the teachers.
It will.
Because they have to come up with projects. And if they're like different projects, assess different projects, well, I'm just like notice like from my own experience, because that's what I have to do. So what are your thoughts about this in terms of like extra teaching load for academic stuff?
It's a really good question, Ivan, and it's not even the only part to it. Like, it's not just workload either. It's also expertise, because it's a different way of teaching, right? So yeah, my thoughts are that we have to, basically my thoughts are that we are in a paradigm shift in terms of generative AI, and we have to rethink what we're doing, because what we're currently doing is not going to fly, essentially. So we will have to rethink in a very fundamental way how we assess. Now, universities will have to think about what that means, because that's partly about reskilling, but it's also about allocating appropriate workload to staff to do this properly. Currently, we have a lot of a lot of teaching is actually done by sessional staff. I don't think that's a bad thing, but they need to be properly remunerated and they need to be properly taught how to assess differently. So if you assess process, as what I've been arguing in the presentation a lot, you need to know how to do that, and you need to know how to do it properly. And so that, that may need some reskilling. The other element to that is that we're in a very dynamic environment. And that creates extra workload as well. Because and this came up yesterday, if you think now, like, I'm going to rethink my assessment to deal with this, so for next semester I'll do this, then the semester after, you have to rethink it again, because different tools have come along. AI strengths have increased by that time, and you have to rethink again. And all of this is going to take extra time. I know that this is a very long answer, but it's a very important point. So I think that we need to think about this at a discipline level, and we need to basically develop communities of practice around this, so that we don't have lecturers in isolation trying to deal with this. We need to deal with this as teams, because one thing that I did see yesterday when we in that workshop that I did yesterday, I basically asked people, like, take one piece of assessment that you're doing now that you have now and rethink it in the context of what I've just talked about. And then they did a bit of a brainstorm at tables, in groups of 3 and 4. And they came up with all sorts of excellent solutions and ways of addressing this. Then others would ask questions, critical questions. And so it becomes like a process of identifying the best ways of dealing with this as a group rather than in isolation, because you keep having to reinvent the wheel by yourself otherwise.
Well, thanks. There's a question in the chat from Jolanta. I'm not sure if you can answer that one, but it's kind of about medical areas. So if they started project-based learning, and I think that's what you mentioned in the beginning of presentation.
Yes, yeah.
So do you know how they actually assess the people? So
yes, so they yes. So they assess both content knowledge and process, right? So and it originated in the medical area because up until that time there was a lot of content knowledge, there was a lot of exams, a lot of but medical staff have to operate in a context. They have to be self-directed, they have to deal with patients, and every patient is different. So you have to be able to think about knowledge in an applied manner. And so PBL allows you to assess like the soft skills or the applied skills and applied knowledge in context. And that's what they do in medical schools that use PBL. There are actual whole institutions, like there's a university in Maastricht that has problem-based learning as kind of like an institutional approach to learning and teaching. And so they do it across different disciplines. They do it in business schools, in engineering, and medical school as well.
well, thanks. Are there any more questions? Anybody would like to ask anything? I just want to share my sort of thoughts. You said that, you showed when you talk about AI in the beginning of presentation, you showed some data from a paper, and then they have like a different levels of dealing with AI. So the first one is ignore and then ban and things like that. So I think now I'm currently at the first level when I just sort of ignore it, but that's probably like not like maybe the right thing to do, because people now talk about this different websites where students get help, and even I'm like trying to like get to those like websites and get like some help from them. So I think at some point we probably need to rethink it, and then also consider it, especially for assessment items. I feel like maybe for project-based learning, when you ask students to work on projects, maybe they can still like use it, but not as much as, for example, if there is kind of questions like in the quizzes and online, let's say online quizzes or exams. I think then they can really get like lots of help from like, let's say, ChatGPT and stuff like that, because I think they're like very powerful. But I feel at some point we should probably also like use it in our teaching, like to also benefit us as academics, not only to students. But I think this is something that we'll need to like think about like in the near future. Otherwise we'll be just like left behind. And I think we need to also embrace this new technology and try to get as much as possible from it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're not the only one who has been ignoring, because we're all, and it's totally understandable. We're all very, very busy. And so this seems like sometimes too much to deal with. And it's interesting because I've had a couple of cases at QUT here where people have said to me like, I've got this assignment of this student has done this assignment. I'm pretty much 100% sure that ChatGPT has done it, but there's nothing you can do at this point, because, you know, unless you've kind of explicitly stated that that's not allowed, unless you have some evidence, and this is the thing, that's the detection issue. Like, you can't actually detect it unless students make a mistake and leave, like, you know, and there's been examples of this as well, that they leave the logo of at the bottom of their assignment. But, you know, students will get better at using this as well. So it's, yeah, ignoring is really in the long term not
I don't
an
think,
option.
yeah, this is an option.
And the thing is, like, the in the first semester of this year, the amount of academic misconduct cases has dropped significantly, which is an interesting thing as well. And you can speculate why that might be, but I have a fair idea why that might be. You know, because we can't protect this. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, well, definitely, like, this is something for us to like think about, and probably like use even like for teaching purposes as well. Yeah, but we still probably like don't know how. We kind of need to like sit down and think and see how we can maybe change our assessment items, so that they cannot just like copy.
You know, the Monash site is really very good. It's a very good starting point to give you an idea of what you might think about when you think about assessment. Yeah, because it's, and the good, I mean, keep in mind that everyone is struggling with this at the moment. You know, like, we're all kind of learning. So that's why I was saying it's good to do this as a group as well, not by yourself. And at the moment, like, if there was any, I would show you some empirical evidence of things that work, but at the moment, there's very little.
I see.
And so that takes a while to generate, but it's early days. But keep an eye on, you know, as soon as there is some empirical evidence, it'd be good to keep that in mind as part of your assessment design of what works and what doesn't.
Well, thanks, Henk. I think it's almost 3 p.m. and I think we should conclude the session. Looks like no more questions, and people need to go. And they also say thank you to you, Henk, for your presentation. And I also want to thank you for your time and for sharing your experience. That's very interesting and useful for everybody. So thanks a lot. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and everybody, thank you for joining this session. This will be recorded, so you can always like play it back if you want to, or share with your colleagues. We're gonna upload the link to our website. Thanks everybody, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks everybody. Bye.